When I say the Socratic method, I'm sure virtually anyone listening at this moment has an idea of what that means. We've probably encountered it in high school or just everyday passing. But not. But I'm gonna venture to say most of the people listening have heard that.
They certainly have heard the name Socrates.
Yes. Well, Agnes Callard, she wrote this book called Open Socrates, The Case for a Philosophical Life, and she expels various notions of who Socrates was, his teachings, what people may or may not get right and wrong about it, and then, as the title implies, makes a case for a philosophical life, what Socrates called the inquiry. So we're going to explore all that. I have Chuck McCaughan here with me today. Longtime listeners probably know who he is. He's my therapist, for lack of a better term, and we love to talk. And he's the one who recommended this book to me. So before we dive into, what the Socratic method is and the book, just what drew you to the book and why it resonated with you, certainly enough to recommend it to me?
Well, somebody recommended it to me.
Okay.
And it was a client of mine, and somebody recommended it to her. And she called me up one day and said, "You have to read this book." She said, "Because you remind me a lot of Socrates." And I immediately laughed, because Socrates is known to be the grandfather of Western philosophy. And I said, "Yeah, okay, yeah, and I also remind you of, Sir Isaac Newton, right?" So we had a little laugh about that. She went, "No, I'm serious, because the work that you do and that we do is really greatly the art of asking the question." And she said, "Socrates didn't have as many answers as you do." And I said, "Is that good or bad?" She goes, "I don't know, but you certainly remind me of the Socratic method in terms of the inquiry and asking questions." So I said, "Okay, I'm going to read it." And I found out by the time I got through the introduction that she was right. I would not even remotely claim to be as Socratic as Socrates, or even that intelligent, but I see it, and I could humbly say, I see that this system that we use and that she uses is very Socratic by nature. It's a deep inquiry, going back and forth. I think that the whole idea that Socrates believed in refuting. He said basically, maybe when you do this, and with one other person, not with a crowd, because wherever there's a crowd, there's, it gets a bit, there's evidence of untruth, but really a really good in-depth investigation and inquiry with one other person. It doesn't take, an entire seminar, Then you really get to the bottom of things, because she also points out in the book that Socrates did not believe that thinking took place just in your head alone. Most people think, well, I think and I think alone. But thinking takes place in a communication, a dialogue with another person. Otherwise, you can fix the game.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think to that end, for better or worse, I think we're going to have to spend some time on these various definitions, right? And I think in order to get to it, right? And I think I'll link to the episodes rather that you and I have done, so people get a firsthand knowledge of the type of work that you do. For a simplified version of it, you essentially use kinesiology to muscle test people and use that as a form of whether something's truthful or not in terms of them. So I think in that sort of explanation, you're very good at seeing where the people's blind spots lie, I think. But the greater thing of it is that search for, I guess, knowledge in general. You can call it enlightenment, you can call it any number of words, but And yeah, I mean, I think for me, I guess, you mentioned it, that thinking as an individual just causes too many blind spots, right? Whereas, and I want to point out one quick thing. Socrates, he had this notion, it's almost better to be refuted because it's a genuine act that they care about you because they're showing you their blind spots. But I guess that's a good question because in general, we don't want to be refuted because we take, what the hell, Chuck?
Yeah, that's
you know
right.
what I mean?
Yeah,
the feathers go up.
Well, to have a Socratic dialogue, number one, you have to be willing to do the inquiry into the depth of things, and you have to do it without ego. You have to do it without defensiveness. You can't, there's a saying in our society, there's your opinion and my opinion, and the truth probably lies somewhere in between. And he really believed that. He believed, okay, someone takes the point of making a statement and then someone refutes that, and then they refute that, and then you refute it back. And, you can't let your ego get involved in that. It's really a search for a truth that neither person actually is fully aware of coming into it. Everybody's got opinions.
Or shouldn't be, at least.
Should be what?
Should not be.
Right.
Because we'll talk about that, but there's people that go in thinking they know the answer, of course.
And that's what Agnes Callard named a untimely question. A question where you are asking a question as if you're doing an inquiry, and maybe even sincerely think you are, but you already have the answer to it. Now, how many of us have done that? We make a point about something, or we ask a question like we're inquiring, and we even have phrases like, don't you think?
Yeah.
And we're putting that in someone's head that they have to agree with what you're thinking. He believed it was better to be, if you had your choice to refute or be refuted, it was better to be refuted because you don't want to be believing false ideas. So if someone else can point something out to you that might reveal that is not sound logic or sound thinking, then you get to become better for that because you're no longer maintaining a false belief.
Yeah. But I think that's what's so interesting, because in society, we have this notion that they ascribe to what success is, right? This general idea that money, perhaps fame, recognition in your field, all these things. And so we adopt these definitions of all these things when in fact they're quite false. And
everybody's got a different definition, basically.
Exactly, yeah. And so, I don't even even beyond just, I guess, the term inquiry, just this notion that, we're just walking around with these definitions in our mind without ever questioning them, right?
And actions without questioning them.
And I don't know. I guess a good perhaps question to ask is, why do you think so many people are against the philosophical life, if that's, the subtitle of the book?
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I could probably accurately say I don't know. But I think people think, what's that got to do with me? That I have to feed the kids. I have to get a better job. I have to be upwardly mobile and go places in life. I need to be respected. I need to be creative. All these things we think we need, and we go for those things basically in the outside world, and we do very little time going inside, doing an inquiry, an introspection of what we really think we know. I think I was saying to you earlier that in the book, as she reports it, somebody went to the oracle in ancient Athens and said, who is the wisest man in the world? And the oracle said, Socrates. And that person came back and reported that to Socrates. And he was almost irritated by it. He was upset by it because he claimed his whole life that he was ignorant, that he was not intelligent, but that he was ignorant. And mind you, it's not to say you're stupid. Stupidity and ignorance are two different things. We think we know things that we don't know. And we've predestined this stuff from our early upbringing, and also in our society, knowing and knowledge and being right are really high premiums. So for people to say, you ask them a question, I really don't know. I mean, that's really a great answer, but often people will say, well, they'll start rolling it out, and they don't really know. Or they think they know because they have already decided what she calls an untimely question, which is a question that's in the wrong point in time. In other words, you're asking a question when you've already decided the answer. So if you've already decided the answer, it's really academic gymnastics, isn't it? Just to wait till you get to the answer that you already know.
Yeah. I haven't put it always to practice, but very early on, there was a great quote taught to me that it's never about what you know, it's about what you do when you don't know. And I think that kind of, in part encapsulates the spirit of this. And one of the notions when it comes to untimely questions, I don't know if this is exact, but the idea that most people aren't really looking for an inquiry on, whether it be the big questions or the smaller questions, but they're looking for a problem to solve. And that might not seem, I guess, like a big distinction, but I'd love for you to talk about why that is, why it is a big distinction.
Well, first off, you got to know something that people are looking for a problem to solve, but they're also creating problems, so they have a problem to solve. There's a phrase that I want to interject in here that doesn't have to do with the book. We don't see the world as it is, we see it as we are. So whatever we are or we think we are inside, that's the way we see the world. And when you change the way that you are, you change the way you see the world. So life is a state of mind. And I think that in answer to your previous question, that people don't see how relevant this kind of inquiry and the seeking of truth, because Socrates believed you need to do an inquiry, as you said, and you need to steer away from falsities or falsehoods and seek out the truth the best you can. And there's a kind of dilemma in that, because if you don't know what the truth is, how do you know what you're looking for? But I see that kind of like all of us really have a lot of radar with other people, and you go into a room and you see someone that is not really being themselves. So you don't know who that person really is, but you know that's not it. There's something about those behavior patterns that doesn't look truthful. So even if you didn't say, I don't contend to say I know who you are, that would be great, but I know that's not it. So when you're seeking out the truth about a situation, there really is, our opinions that we come in with. You allow those to be refuted, and then it's all a kind of way. His way of Socratic system was a way of persuading or being persuaded. Mm-hmm. And if you can't persuade that person, they'll try to persuade you. And if they don't persuade you, then you go back again until something wonderful happens if you stay with it, whereas you come to a truth that neither one of you saw before.
Yeah.
And as Agnes Callard says, most of us spend our lives living 15 minutes in the future. I got to go. It's just it's depression. I don't have time for this. I got to go. I got to get my hair done. I got to make an appointment. We're all living at what's going to happen 15 minutes ahead. Of course, that when you get to that 15 minutes, you're living for the next 15 minutes ahead. So you end up never sitting down and really sinking into the moment and the inquiry. So
looking at it from that vantage point, as I sort of look at it, and feel free to poke holes, right? To me, it's almost like the scientific method, where, you have this notion that you're testing for, you do various experiments, you come to a conclusion based on that.
Observations.
But in my mind, you do the best you can. Like you and I could sit here for whatever amount of time, and it's like, okay, we'll take this idea, we'll poke holes in it until we feel like we can't get to any other form of it, and that's correct. And then tomorrow, something may pop up that's incorrect, right? So here's a very dumbed down version of it in terms of the scientific method. We go out into the world, we'll look at every duck imaginable, and we'll just see black ducks. So we'll be like, all ducks are black. But all it takes is one white duck to come along and refute that. But until we see that, it's the best we can do. And so I think, I don't know if that's a correct way of looking at it, but it's like you try to be the best you can until something else presents itself.
What makes the scientific method distinct is the very last aspect of a lot of testing, a lot of observation and blind testing, and then peer testing, et cetera, is that in the end, I'm not a scientist, and you're not either, but I do know this much, that the last principle in that is that whatever conclusions are drawn in a scientific endeavor, it's always open for revision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So they leave that open, that H2O has always made water so far, but there may be a circumstance in which it does not. So, one of the big problems with organized religion is usually people that believe a specific religion, they're very dogmatic about it. This is the one and only religion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's a whole group of people within those things. Let's just take Christianity, for example. They come in and they try to prove scientifically that Jesus was the Son of God and the Christian God is the one and only God. Except they're leaving out the best part of the scientific method, which is that's fully open for revision. Yeah. That is not an option there. So, unless I'm not knocking any religion, I'm simply saying, there is such a high premium on knowing in our society and being right. I mean, people will get violent about it. They will get extremely defensive about it. And if you really want to experience freedom, don't have to be right anymore. Drop needing to know. I really don't know. We talk about a lot of stuff like we're experts in those fields, and we really don't know. We don't know who somebody else is. We can see what they do. We can say, okay, you did this action, that action, but we really don't know who they are. And they will be lucky in their lifetime to find out who they are themselves. That would be really good.
Yeah, this is kind of jumping a little ahead, but what I found very interesting was part of approaching the inquiry is to see someone on an equal plane as you. So regardless of, someone might be a Nobel Prize winner or whatever, but seeing each other in an elevated form rather than an inferior and superior. And I think in today's society, that's almost like that can be really tough because we are infinitely creative at finding divisions, I would say. And also part and parcel of that, Agnes makes the notion that you should never bond over complaining. And I picked that out in particular. This might make you chuckle because I feel like I've definitely bonded with many people over complaining.
Yeah, we all bond over, not just the good stuff, but some of the bad stuff too.
Yeah. And so I'm just, there's not necessarily a question there, but I'm just kind of curious your thoughts on that notion of seeing each other in our elevated form and how one, I guess, perhaps can go about that.
From my viewpoint and my teachers' viewpoint, which are my teachers that tend to be the ones that have been acknowledged as enlightened people, we all share the same consciousness. Now, that may be very disturbing to some people. It was certainly disturbing to me when I first heard it. Wait a minute, I have the same consciousness as Ted Bundy, serial killer, or some person I don't like at all. They have the same consciousness as me. Well, that's true. We do. We all have the same consciousness, so we couldn't talk about the things we talk about. We couldn't even speak the same language. Now, you add mind to consciousness. Consciousness is universal in human beings, across the board. But then you add a mind to it, that mind has a history, and its number one job is to think, to create thinking, and to tell stories. The mind is just a big storyteller. It never stops telling stories, ever. And it will very quickly after any event, whether you like it or don't like it, it will sometimes frantically at times create a story around that to explain how you feel the way you feel. So the consciousness itself is neutral. Intelligence is neutral. And then we fill our intelligence with certain things. And that's when it becomes distinctively separate. So if you honor everyone and realize that we all have the same consciousness, it's neutral. And it's I am. That's it. That's the only thing you can really know. Everything else, you start to fall off the balance beam. I am a doctor. I'm a lawyer. I'm an actor. I am a good person. I'm a bad person. Then you start to fall off the beam there. So the only place you can really go to, and I'm taking this from my teachers, people like Rupert Spira and Katie, the only thing you can, Byron and Katie, the only thing you can really know is I am. That's the only thing you can really know for certain. And how can you know that? Because you're watching yourself think. You're watching yourself be. You can see that you are. But beyond that, then you start to add these definitions that you were talking about in the beginning. Do two people have the same definition of love? That's questionable.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So that's the reason to do an inquiry, is to get to the bottom of what you think and what you believe. And maybe you can begin to modify those beliefs. No one's going to convince you to believe something other than what you believe. But if you do the inquiry yourself, you might convince yourself, oh, why was I thinking that? Why was I believing that?
So I think, to that effect, a lot of, I know we're kind of perhaps going in a circle here. A lot of inquiry falls apart because of that notion. People are going in with an agenda. Let's take politics, right? We'll just make believe I'm left, you're right, and I'm trying to convince you, right, that I'm correct and stuff like that. So I think that becomes a first division rather than with that true notion of seeing perhaps someone's humanity. And even if I believe you to be wrong, one of the things I appreciate, she wrote, I can recognize your search for it, right? So in the context of what you're talking about, recognize that deep down, you want to be a good human. I think we all do, right? Like that. And we have that consciousness we all came from. So it's so going into it for me, it would be, okay, well, help me understand this. Like, you are someone that I know to be kind, this, and that. So how did you get to here? And rather than have a preconceived notion of you were brainwashed or whatever, I should just let you actually answer and learn from it.
Right.
I don't know. Feel free to reflect on that or poke holes at it or.
Well, we all have a history.
Mm-hmm.
We all have a past, and a lot of that is very early environment. Mm-hmm. Your parents can't teach you something they don't know. So if they teach you people are to be trusted, to not be trusted, then that's the only thing that they know. And that's what they're going to teach you. They're going to do the best they can to teach you that people can't be trusted. But you can't teach something to somebody that you don't know. So we get locked into these frames of mind. And I think one of the reasons it causes people maybe later in life to start to find a real value for the inquiry into one's life and what one feels and what one thinks is that things aren't working, that they don't work very well. I mean, the mind is a storyteller, and there is no story in your mind that's true, good, bad, or ugly. There's no story that's true. It's just another story. So if you can get beyond your stories, and I'm not saying that an incident in your past didn't happen, your father abandoned you or whatever. And nobody's going to argue with that. But what is the story that comes along with that? And unless you're willing to look at the inquiry of that and be able to separate the story, because the mind is a storyteller, that's what it's going to do. And until you can separate the event, which is fundamentally neutral, so your father wasn't there, okay, and you concluded. The mind makes conclusions, and those quickly become stories. And that whole point of doing the inquiry is to go in and separate those things, the event from the story. That means my father didn't love me. Well, maybe it doesn't mean that. Maybe his father abandoned him, and that's the way that they did things in that family, and it's got nothing to do with you. My question to you would be, what do you think the high points of this book are? Because it's 300 and some pages, 375 pages long, and sometimes a little heavy going. So what would you pick out as the high points in there?
So I would kind of conclude it in this way. We both like Don Miguel Ruiz, and I think The Voice of Knowledge, which speaks to about the fifth agreement. Most people know Don Miguel Ruiz for the four agreements,
Right.
But they never go a little bit deeper into the fifth one, which is, I think, paraphrasing, learn to listen, but also doubt. And so
Be skeptical. Yeah.
be skeptical. And so that learn to listen, having, honest dialogue and really see that, but doubt. And, in the Socratic method, feel free to poke holes. And the reason why that sort of one-on-one interaction is important is because she brings up the notion of wavering, right? You can call it hypocritical or whatever. We see hypocrisy in other people very well. We are almost incapable of seeing it within ourselves. And so that's where the mirror, the other person, comes in to point those things out to us of like, hey, you keep saying you're kind, but you keep yelling at your dog or whatever it is.
Don't be too aggressive, but the squeaky wheel gets the oil.
Yeah.
I mean, we depending on, especially in politics, this is very obvious. As Agnes Callard points out, if you are loyal to left-wing ideas and you're a left-wing thinker, then that's a good thing, but if you're listening to that and you're a right-wing thinker, you're a traitor. So, it all depends on the angle you're coming from. But again, it still has to come down to an honest inquiry and the ability to be refuted, and don't ask untimely questions, meaning questions that you already have an answer for. And you're not really doing a real inquiry when you ask the question. This is, I think, tantamount to, what's put forth in this book and Socratic philosophy. And when the heat gets up and people have a lot of emotions and a lot of attachments to their beliefs, then people don't want to continue on with those discussions. And they may be right in front of the paycheck. I got to go. I don't have time for this. And people don't realize that this is all a process of seeking the truth, if there is a truth, and getting rid of false ideas and keeping your ego and your righteousness out of it, period. In the end, Socrates was sentenced to death by the Athenian state for basically one charge only. And I knew this. I knew something of the Socratic method before I read this book. It's such a tremendous book. For corrupting the youth, impiety, teaching them to think in renegade ways that didn't go along with the status quo in ancient Athens. I mean, it in itself was a paradox because
I find that very hilarious, and to me it's most evident in religion. It's like, okay, if yours is the one truth, then it doesn't matter what I read, see, and try.
Right. And
yours is always going to be the truth.
That's right, because you've already made up your mind that that's going to be the conclusion. But the Athenian state itself was known as the first democratic state in the Western world, and we look at it as the grandfather of democracy, and yet people had slaves.
Yeah.
You were most prized for your physical appearance and your ability to be an orator, be a good speaker in public. But Socrates himself was known to be a very homely person, very ugly and very short and a pug nose. There was nothing beautiful about him physically, but his way of looking at things was what made him the grandfather of Western philosophy. And then there's a lot of spin-offs and all that stuff. He also teaches you not to waver. Wavering is a big deal.
Maybe I took the definition of untimely questions to be a little bit too literal. And because kind of what you're talking about, at a certain point, we're all faced, and the inquiry happens once we're faced with something that we've been avoiding. So to me, I took kind of untimely questions almost as like, okay, you don't want to face the idea of death. You're not inquiring death, but then your best friend dies or your parent dies when you're 10 years old. And so now you can't help but be faced with that question. Right. I guess, is that a misreading of what untimely questions is? Is there an allowance for two definitions or multiple? I don't know. Or do you see what I'm drawing in fitting in somewhere else within this greater Socratic method?
Well, I think that an untimely question is a question that's out of time, meaning the question is asked after the answer has already been embraced.
Yeah. And I say that because, when someone loses, I use the word death because it's one of those where everyone's like, well, why did this person have to die? Like we ask that question as if we're
as if there was an answer.
As if there was an answer, and as if the answer wasn't, well, they just died and it was their time. Which seems callous, but I don't know if there's a better answer.
Well, I think that I'm going to go back to that being right and knowing are at a really high premium in our society. And that ultimately creates stupidity. When the truth is, the way that Socrates came to terms with the oracle saying that he was the wisest human being on earth was because he said that he was ignorant. He truly believed he was ignorant. And ignorance and stupidity are two different things, as I said earlier. A child is ignorant. It doesn't know how to drive a car. It doesn't mean the child is stupid. It's not old enough to have learned that yet. So, Socrates' greatest basis for the Socratic method was you have to first embrace that you're ignorant, that you do not know. Without doubt, you do not know.
What is that? Sorry to cut you off, but I find it hilarious. You can see this evident in parties where you and I might be talking. There's a small group and it's like, hey, have you seen this movie? And the person who's never heard or definitely not seen the movie, like, oh yeah, good movie. He's like, well, why? Why not allow for the discovery of like, you know what? I haven't seen that movie. Tell me about it. What did you like about it?
And a myriad of other subjects that people expound to be expert in because they've read 3 lines about something somewhere, including the scientific method. We are ignorant. And you know what? To embrace that is your first step into freedom. It is not a humiliation. It's the truth. We don't really know. We don't know how long we're going to live. We don't know who somebody else is. We don't even know why they do what they do. I was talking to someone recently that I think has a great philosophy on life, and it works with my wife at the health clinic she works at. And I said, I thought maybe I should be saying that he's a massage therapist, and he was giving me a massage. We were just chatting. I said, Allison, with what I know about psychology, I probably should have never married her because she didn't have a good relationship with her father. And he said, oh, really? He didn't know that. And I said, yeah, he was pretty mean and aggressive, towards her. And I think he thought that she was a lot like his wife who divorced him. And so she was the female of his 2 children. And his first response to me was, well, he must have had something horrible happen to him in his childhood. Because people aren't unkind to other people for no reason. That's not really our nature. And I said, I don't know about that. I don't know about his childhood, but I do know that he had married somebody before Allison's mother. and that she died in childbirth, and the baby died in childbirth, and she died 4 or 5 months later. So he lost both of them. And he went, well, there you go. So we don't take that into consideration when somebody like our father or our mother doesn't treat us well, that they have a history too, that they're not just devils, they're not just mean and out to get you. And we take this all so personally. Maybe a father or a mother that abandoned you as a child was abandoned as a child. So that's what a family looks like to them. But until you do the inquiry and be willing to say, I don't really know. But instead, we're very subjective individuals. We grow up, children grow up believing the whole world revolves around them until they're taught that it doesn't. But that's very much in our programming. So we all take way too much stuff personally, including when people are unkind to us.
Well, so...
And you need to do an inquiry to get through that.
So there's irony to the statement, they take things personally, but I would argue that part of why people are resistant to whether the inquiry, call it therapy, and what I think a lot of people do go to therapists, but I think there is a boundary because eventually they want to, not everyone, but see themselves as a victim. And rather than actually take things personally and be like, okay, how am I culpable in X, Y, and Z situation? Because I think there has to be a certain point that, like, I don't know, people are trying to seek justice everywhere. Yeah, and it's like, okay, well, yes, you can obviously go about it. And I'm not arguing that, like, if something heinous happens that you can't seek legal ramifications and stuff like that. But also seeing, to a large extent, your agency within that to be able to...
Well, yeah. But you see, we don't want to be to blame for anything, most people, because what happens when you get blamed for something, you perceive that they take the love away or the acceptance away. One of the things that Socrates backed people up on and just aggravated a lot of people was he would say, look, okay, let's talk about honor. Let's talk about virtue. And oh, I know what virtue is. Virtue for a slave is this. Virtue for a master is this. Virtue for a politician is this. But nobody defined the word virtue. So before you can have a discussion about anything, you got to be able to have a discussion about what is the definition of that particular asset or that word. Otherwise, you may be talking about two different things, right through, including the word love. What do you think love is? What is love? If you think, I had a client say to me, love is you doing everything I want you to do, when I want you to do it, and how I want you to do it. That's love. Now, that was one of the wildest versions of definitions of love I ever heard in my life. But that was that person's definition, and that's how they lived their life. And if you didn't do what they wanted you to, when they wanted you to, and you didn't agree with them and do it in short order, you didn't love them.
Well, that is interesting because I remember we did a inquiry into, you mentioned all we can know is I am, but then you and I did an inquiry of like, well, what is I?
Exactly.
If we're going to say I am, what the hell is the I?
And what's am as well? And absolutely, that's correct. She opens this book. I don't tend to like introductions for books. I mean, I want to get through the introduction and I want to go to chapter 1. I want to start with the meat of the book. And this introduction is 22 pages long. And I thought, oh my God. I took a fan through it and looked at it and went, oh no. But it turns out to be the best introduction to any book I've ever read in my 75 years of living, period. And she compares Tolstoy, Leo Tolstoy, War and Peace, Anna Karenina, and the writer is famous as Shakespeare. His view of life was a life of inquiry is a waste of time, and it's not worth doing because you can't answer these questions anyway. Like, what is the purpose of my life? Why am I here? What is the purpose of educating my children? What is the purpose of achieving anything since we're all going to die in the end? What Tolstoy didn't realize, he'd already asked an untimely question. He had already decided that life had no meaning, period. On the other hand, Socrates took the exact opposite position, and that's why she juxtaposed those two people, because Socrates believed that an uninquired life is not worth living. If you don't know, delve into it. So, I mean, you're an artist. Why are you an artist?
Yeah, I mean, that's the irony of Tolstoy, right? Is that his characters were inquiring.
Well, what he couldn't solve in life, he put into his novels and tried to get his characters to solve them. So there was a real expression of that. But he had already determined, and something I didn't know, that Tolstoy spent most of his life thinking he should commit suicide because life is meaningless. So Socrates was the exact opposite, and the Athenian state put him to death for corrupting the youth. And he did defend himself, but he would not run away because he didn't believe that was ethically right. His friends tried to all hijack him and get him out of there, and he ended up taking the hemlock himself. But he didn't waver in his belief structure. You know, again, she's got a whole thing about wavering and how common that is, even in folklore in our country. You know, one minute you're saying this, and the next minute you're saying that. Well, wait a minute, which one is it? Some people would accuse him of always saying the same thing, and he accused them of always changing their mind about the same thing. So,
yeah, what was slow and steady wins the race, but what's the opposite of that? You have to be impatient or just early bird gets the worm sort of a thing.
Yeah, there's a ton of these things that we teach people, including, murder is wrong, but if you're a member of the army, you can go murder the other side all you like.
Yeah.
Or, we have a democratic idea in this country that, every man deserves his day in court and a right to a trial. And then we send drones out and kill people on highways in Yemen somewhere, without a trial.
So you bring up a good point. It was in my mind to talk about it, but she does spend quite a bit on war as this like testing of ideals. But
who does?
She does in the book. This idea that like you're essentially trying to prove your point through brute force, when in reality, the only way to actually do it is through actual inquiry. Because you may have, factually killed off and destroyed your enemy, but that doesn't mean the idea has died. And she spends quite a bit talking about that. And so, we live in a world that has quite a number of wars. So I guess it is poignant, and wars have been never constant.
Yeah, and what's very topical about that is the whole war in the Gaza Strip, and Netanyahu and the Israelis are going to destroy Hamas completely. There will be no more Hamas. They will wipe every last one of them out. That's never going to happen. You can wipe out it's with Socrates, you can kill the man, but you can't kill the ideas. And 2,500 years later, his ideas are still alive. So you can't do that and people try to win arguments by screaming at each other as well. Whoever can get the loudest is going to win the argument, or the angriest. And it's not true. And these are false ideas. And these are, whether they be more complicated than that or as simple as that, we owe it to ourselves to do an inquiry into what we think and what we believe, and why do we do what we do. Why have you choose to become a creative person? Well, I just am. Well, it's not quite that simple. There's something behind that, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm not even saying going to war is right or wrong either. When someone is a threat to your way of life, and the only way you can manage to stop it is if they kill your family, you kill their family. I don't approve of that, but I'm not making a judgment on it. But the inquiry is what is necessary. And we might find out that we're all pretty much the same, that consciousness is universal. it's our experience that supersedes that, and the way our mind develops, and therefore the way our thinking develops, is where the division occurs. But consciousness itself is universal. Your worst enemy has the same consciousness as you do, as a neutral item. Intelligence is also neutral. It's just a neutral item. It's a tool that we humans have, or any animal has. But then what do we fill that intelligence with? Beliefs and ideas.
Yeah.
And that doesn't make them right or wrong. So, I mean, I hope something we're saying here today will stimulate somebody to read this book, because, it might be a little bit taxing at times, but the juxtaposition between Leo Tolstoy and Socrates, just one believed that life without inquiry was not worth living, and the other one said that inquiry is a complete waste of time, and life is meaningless. But Tolstoy, who was a very, very intelligent guy and a very famous literary figure, was asking these questions when he had already come to an untimely question. They were all untimely questions, because he had come to this conclusion that we're all going to die anyway, and it was all pointless.
Well, going back to an earlier notion and tying this in, the idea that like people just don't have time, right? They might say like, okay, I could use some therapy, and I'll just use that word all-encompassing just for the purposes of speeding things along. But they don't have time, they don't have the money, and so forth. And yet they carry that baggage with them. And to the lesser extent, like as I, kind of progress in my ladder of it, I'm able to recognize certain people carrying the same baggage as me. And I'm like, my heart aches for them, because I'm like, you could speed up your life so much better if you just chose, to do things differently. And I think that's what the Socratic method is speaking to. It's not to say that like, okay, your life is going to be outright miserable, but it could be better. I don't know. Is that?
No, I think that we all know it could be better, but we keep, as the old saying goes, we keep doing everything the same and wondering why nothing changes. You got to do something different to get a different result, to get a different outcome. And I'm not saying even that everybody should go do therapy. There is an aspect of me that over the years of doing therapy and studying my teachers, which are the enlightened people, or the recognized people that have been recognized as being enlightened. And there's a lot of definitions of enlightenment, and mine is simply returning to who and what you really are. That's it. That's the state of enlightenment. Other people say love, living in a state of love is enlightenment, or living without any form of resistance is a form of enlightenment. But again, people can say, well, what's this got to do with my life? It doesn't pay the rent. It doesn't pay the mortgage. It doesn't get my shoes and clothes for my children. But in a strange way, it does. Because the more of who you really are, the more you can get back to who you really are, truly are, then the more that you're manifesting that uniqueness that's you. And there's something about people that are really themselves that when we run across them, I mean, you either hate them because it makes you feel horrible that you are not your true self. But most often, I think it's uplifting. How did they do that? How can they be like that? Why don't they care? Why aren't they intimidated by the same things I'm intimidated by? Because what's in the priority position is just being who they are, being themselves. I asked someone recently, how do you get along with this person it's pretty much a recognizable pathological narcissist, but everybody that works for him, everybody knows him, pretty much knows that. And I said, how do you get along with him? And he said, but of course. And I said, why? Most people do not get along with him. And he said, it's simple, Chuck. I don't expect anybody to be anything than what they are. I don't have an alternative solution for them. I just accept them for what they are. Is this guy stupid? No. Is he extremely intelligent? Yes, in my opinion, he is. So he sees the same stuff that you and I see. But he doesn't expect them to be any different. Nor does he expect to be their teacher. So he does teach with very subtle phrases. Like you give him a description of this person who's a black person or a Chinese person or whatever, and then this and that, but they're very intelligent. And he'll go, okay. And in that okay is a world of things like, okay, why are you telling me all this? Why do I need all the things that you see and determine about this person when I don't need that information? Because he just accepts people as they are. And of course, the key to that is he accepts himself as he is. And so, I have a saying in my work, and which is take the finger, stop pointing it out there. There's no returning that, and turn it around on yourself. Why do you see things that way? Why are you angry? I think, I certainly had a horrible anger problem for a long time, but I had to turn it back around and say, okay, what are you really angry about? And give that anger a voice. I was good at that. Give the suffering in your life a voice. Let it speak. Let it tell its whole story. And then try to separate the story from the event. And pretty soon you'll find the event is become neutralized.
Now let's take it to I believe, the hardest portion of this. So I think a lot of people can look at a past event and be like, okay, yeah, I was wrong. But in Open Socrates, she makes the argument that Socrates said, don't say I was wrong. I am wrong. And I was even talking to a friend yesterday.
I like that.
And, we kind of had, she was like, okay, I don't know if I want to admit I'm wrong. Like that. And it's like, well, here's the thing. Not that I have this overall way of it, but I said to her, well, again, look back at all the times you were wrong and how beneficial it was to you. So maybe just leave open the possibility that, like, if you're wrong now, how great it could be for you in the future.
Or in the now.
Yeah.
So, that is true. She does point that out, that people are more than happy to say, okay, well, I may not have been the best parent, or I may have done that wrong. But we don't like to say I am wrong, because that puts it in present tense. And that is very offensive to our egos. Our egos immediately, almost always, and our storytelling mind go into defense mode. Okay. I see it now. I'm wrong about that. Okay. That's harder than say, okay, yeah, I made some mistakes in the past, Yeah, bring it into the present. And it doesn't hurt. You think it's going to hurt because you've been taught that you need to be intelligent, you need to be smart, you need to know, you need to be right, not wrong. Nobody loves wrong people, but they do. And we all share this in common. And if we could just embrace this idea that we're ignorant, we don't really know. It's like taking a breath of fresh air. And the minute you can separate the story from the event completely, this mind jumps in quick and starts telling stories, then you get a real breath of freedom. It's okay not to know. It's okay to be wrong. It's okay. There's no one here on this planet that knows everything, and there's no one that hasn't been wrong. There's no such animal.
So when I think about this, I think part of people's pushback is like, okay, the Socratic method is just two people talking endlessly till they die, and they never get right. As Tolstoy would argue, that they don't get anywhere, right? So what's the point? And so let me know if this is a good viewpoint of it in terms of a practical approach, because I do want to kind of, how people can apply it to some of this stuff. No different than going to the gym. People, whatever, they go 2-3 times, even once, whatever it is, a week, but they make the time to do it. And so in that sense, I look at this as a form of that, where it's like, okay, it's not to say you have to spend your entire waking week doing it, but set aside meaningful time to have these conversations. And, maybe initially you spend a little bit more time and then it becomes a little bit easier and you can, spend 2 hours, like 2 hours a week, by the way, like for people to just have this, like that would be miraculous. I don't know. I'll apply that.
Well, that
term.
would be great if people did that, but
But is that a good way to like practically approach it in terms of how one can apply it? And then throughout the week, certain things might get tested. Like, you and I, we see each other pretty regularly, and I go out into the world and I'm feeling light as a feather. And then there's pushback from the world and I come back a little bit beaten up and we look into that, right? Like, is that a good a way to actually approach this? Sure,
but you have to ask it when you do go out there and you feel good because you've shifted your consciousness and life's a state of mind, and then the world pushes back on you on something. What's it pushing against? Instead of just saying, oh, the world's pushing back on me, raining on my parade, what's it pushing against that's causing you that discomfort? Because you're simply, the hardest thing for anybody to do is just be. It's so simple. Simply be. So we sit there in lotus position and cross our arms and we just be for a minute. And then, you got to go do something.
Well, not even that. I mean, even if you don't, there's like a twitch and, you start to feel, tickle on your nose, whatever it is.
It seems to be the hardest thing in the world to just be. And whoever named us human beings really got it right. Somewhere back in history. We are human beings, but we don't spend very much time simply being. And we think that, so many people think their worth is based on their bank account, for example, because, what's your net worth? They ask you, the government asks you, what's your net worth? So we use that word in terms of money and assets a lot. But our worth it's so far beyond all that. And there's so many people that have become billionaires and millionaires who've, committed suicide because but look at this, see how much money I've made. Look at all I've done. Look at all the good I've done. And nobody appreciates them, and that they have this worth that can often be put in materialistic terms because their worth is far greater than that. And of course, we didn't always have parents that taught us that. And they weren't being evil. They were taught that. They have a history too. And we have a tendency to take pretty much everything that happens out there personally. I mean, people even take hurricanes personally. They're not personal. Nothing is personal. So, this is the thing Socrates lived to do, was to get in and break down and start back at the beginning. Okay, if we're going to talk about a subject, then we have to define that subject first off. What is virtue? What is honor? And then we can talk about it. And I think in the book someone says about virtue for a slave is this, virtue for a statesman is this, virtue for a husband is this, virtue for a wife is this, blah, blah, blah. But stop. We haven't defined virtue yet. You're telling me all the different garden varieties of virtue, but you're not telling me what it is itself. And I think that people find that a bit tedious. What's the point of those conversations? But, you can live your life thinking that, knowing that you're going to die, we all do, and that the life is fundamentally meaningless. But, people say, I don't know what the purpose of my life is. It's whatever you decide it is.
Well, I think even more in more basic terms, whether it's virtue or I've heard a lot of the term like loyalty. You're not loyal. And that creates a frustration. It's like, okay, well, you're presupposing a definition of what you think is loyalty, and you've deemed me unloyal,
right?
Or vice versa.
Or you betrayed me.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And therefore that causes anger, pain, resentment, and
sure. Or you lied to me.
Yeah.
Nobody in this world has not told a lie. And if I was anybody listening to this, I wouldn't be that concerned with who's lying to you. You can probably tell who's lying to you. But the much more difficult proposition is looking at and seeing how you're lying to yourself.
What's funny? I don't even look at...
It's too close. It's too myopic.
Maybe this is dumb of me, but I don't even care if people lie. Like, I try more than like. There's times people be like, that person lied to you. I'm like, well, I guess it says more about them than it does me.
Or they're lying to themselves, and you could very easily go, wow, that's entertaining. We have a choice at any given moment. I mean, if everybody was, so often we try to get other people to be like us and think like us. But let's say you finally got your wish and everybody you met was just like you, thought like you, talked like you, and believed like you. How bored would you be? I mean, it would be incredibly boring to live in a world of nothing but doppelgangers that are just like you.
Yeah. So,
isn't that why we love the opposite sex?
Yeah.
Because they're not like us. There's something different about them that, that's exciting and entertaining.
So this is opening up a big can of worms, especially as we wrap out. But I am curious, as I think with the Socratic method, obviously it requires intimacy, right? That someone that you trust to be able to have that dialogue. And I think, unfortunately, that's something that we're losing. And I hope I'm wrong, but it feels like it's going to get compounded with AI. And people are, I don't know if you watch this stuff, people are having all like very intimate, forget the sexual stuff, but like therapeutic dialogues with whether ChatGPT or whatever else. And, some might argue, well, like, oh, well, aren't they doing that? And it's like, I don't think that's, I think the Socratic method, I think by definition has to be with a human, not.
Well, that's true because, AI is basic algorithms and information put into computers, in large quantities. But you got to remember, it's garbage in, garbage out.
Well, even then, it's
good
best.
Stuff in, good stuff out. But
Vince Gilligan, the creator of Breaking Bad and now Pluribus, he talked about it. He's like, if anything, just points out how predictable humans are.
Fortunately.
But beyond that, it doesn't have a soul.
Well, and to sum this up, the Socratic method is basically a system of inquiry, refuting, persuasion, and counter-persuasion. It necessarily requires to keep your ego out of it and to be open-minded. You cannot do it with a closed mind because then you're into
absolutely
all the rest of that stuff. And also the seeking of truth and the avoidance of falsities. And if you can go by those things, keep an open mind, be willing to get in a discussion without ego and without defensiveness, seeking the truth and avoiding false conclusions and falsities, you can really discover some stuff between you. Mm-hmm. And he really pointed out that this is something you do with one other person. Because, as the philosopher Kierkegaard said, let's say you're in a crowd and the crowd tramples someone to death, and someone says to you, well, you trampled that person to death. And you say, no, I didn't trample that person to death. The crowd trampled the person to death. Yeah, but the crowd was made up of people like you, individuals like you, so therefore you're a part of trampling that person to death. No, I'm not. So wherever there's mass quantities of people or crowds, Kierkegaard concluded that there is evidence of untruth. Wherever there is responsible, conscientious individuals, that you will find the way to truth because you'll take responsibility for whatever your part in that was. So,
very well said. So I would love to, if you haven't read the book, we encourage you to check it out. Listen, we don't, no one's paying us to sponsor this book or anything. We just happen to like it. But beyond that, and maybe this is a fool's errand, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Is there a simple inquiry we can task them with to kind of go after? Or is that just a fool's errand and they should just read the book and start inquiring in their own life?
It's very helpful to read this book. It can be a little heavy going. You can start with an inquiry of who am I? Or what am I?
Okay.
Are you really a doctor? Are you really a lawyer? Are you really an actor? Are you, because you write, is that what you are? You're a writer. Well, you're a writer if you write, but that's not what you are. Like a rose has an essence, which is roseness, or apple. Try to describe the quality of an apple. Oh, well, it's red. Well, so is a fire engine. It's sweet. Well, so is sugar. So is the only thing you can really say is the essence of the quality of an apple is appleness. Mm-hmm. In the end. So there's you-ness, and what is that? And who would you be? Who do you think you are? This is the problem. We think we are this or that or that. But if you really do an inquiry into that, who do you think you are, you will find out that anything that you actually think you are, you're not. You are pure consciousness is what you really are. And that doesn't feel very exciting. It doesn't have a lot of bells and whistles to it. But that's what you are. You are pure consciousness. Without that, you wouldn't even know you were here. You wouldn't know you existed. So then out of consciousness is born the mind, and out of the mind is born thinking. So now we're really getting off the balance beam. So if you start looking at that and you say, okay, all I am really is pure consciousness, and then that has generated a mind, because a lot of people believe they are their mind. No, they aren't. They're pure consciousness. And out of that, a mind is developed. And that mind starts to make conclusions and tell stories based on what has happened to you in your life, or hasn't happened either. And then you create thoughts. And now we're really in trouble. And that's a natural progression. I'm not saying the mind is going to do anything, but even a story is a thought. But, once you realize that no thought is true, it's not anything solid in the physical world. And one day you're thinking that, what a good boy am I, or a good girl am I, and the next minute you're thinking I'm a piece of garbage. Well, neither one of them are true.
No.
So, then you're never going to stop your mind from thinking. Even the greatest yogis have never been able to sit down and meditate and stop the mind from thinking for very long, because then it has the thought, well, look, I'm not thinking. Well, that's a thought. So, you can't stop it. All you can do is neutralize the stuff that's causing you to suffer. So as Adyashanti says in his book, Falling into Grace, if you really want to never, ever, ever suffer again, I have a solution for you. Stop thinking. Because you cannot suffer without thinking. Thinking creates the suffering. And what you think about either creates happiness or sadness or suffering or whatever. So nobody's going to stop thinking, but you can neutralize the thought. It's kind of like, thank you for sharing. Okay, nice story. That's all you can do. Because it's going to, the brain and the mind are going to keep functioning, and they're going to keep thinking. So, you get what I'm saying?
I get what you're saying.
It's what you focus your thinking on, and what you think you believe, and you believe you have a lot of evidence for it. And this is what Socrates was all about. He was in, okay, let's get into this. Let's tear this apart. Well, how do you make that conclusion? And if you can get to the basis of that, you get set free. So, I really, Socratic thinking is alive and well today, but so are a lot of other forms of philosophical thinking. But it really is, this book really is a case for living a philosophical life and having real effect in your life.
Yeah. Well, certainly we've tried to highlight that. Obviously, we could continue on and on. It is like all things, right? It's the pursuit of a lifetime. It's not one and done. So this is but a timestamp of
and it's really refreshing. It's really refreshing to get to do an inquiry and get rid of these self-demeaning and self-deprecating thoughts you have about yourself, because you really are a miracle, as we were talking about earlier. Life is a miracle. Anything alive, an amoeba, it's a miracle. But we don't believe that. And Tolstoy believed he should have committed suicide years before. He just didn't for religious reasons and other reasons, because life was meaningless. But that's an already foregone conclusion. He starts with that conclusion, that we're going to die anyway, so therefore life is meaningless. And then he tries to answer the questions of what's the meaning of life when he's already got a conclusion. That's an untimely question.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining me yet again. I'm sure we'll do some other books or other discussions in the future. We hope you've enjoyed it. Hopefully this has enticed you to just be inquisitive. And as always, feel free to let us know comments, thoughts.
You know, as you said one day, as you started to read this Agnes Callard has written, I think, 3 books, but this is her magnum opus. This is her swan song so far. This is her masterpiece.
Well, thank you for joining us. Hope to see you next time.